All right, so this next one is kind of a follow-up on the video we did on your channel regarding international start times and a point that we raised during that one. Now, we know that the UFC's current deal with ESPN is due to expire in 2025, and there has been a lot of, we'll call them preliminary talks regarding whether that partnership gets renewed or if the UFC maybe becomes part of a major streaming network, like a Netflix, for example. Interestingly, this is a topic that will probably impact American audiences more than others in part of the negotiations, because they seem to be centered very much on the UFC moving away from a pay-per-view model. So this is kind of like a two-part question. Is this a direction you think the UFC is going to go in? And kind of as a little bit of a sidebar, you don't necessarily have to answer this one in too much detail if you don't want to, but how do you think that might impact fighters on the roster as well?
So first one, do I think this is the direction that the UFC is going to go in? No. The reason I say that is because of how much the pay-per-view part of their deal, that income, that revenue, is part of their bottom line. It's a major part of their bottom line. They still operate on the same core fundamentals as boxing. And until they stray away from that and start to really see themselves as one of the big four in the US, as far as sports are concerned, then they're going to stay, kind of reliant on that pay-per-view model. It's just kind of the way it works for them. The only way that they can move away from that is to start to look at leagues, which is something, I've brought up many, many times that I wish that they went towards, is starting to operate the same way as a league. Then that would alleviate the pressure of having to go out and promote each one of these pay-per-views the way that they do. They could have it on a major network and have it be appointment television for a variety of people. That's the way that ESPN, I think, wants to push them to go. But I don't know if they want to go that way. If they move to Netflix, then they may have to go that way because Netflix doesn't have that built into their model at this point. And where would they get the revenue from? That would be Netflix coming out of pocket to pay them large sums of money for those projects, or for UFC to go to another medium to push their product out. ESPN is the platform right now. They'd have to go somewhere different. So there's a lot of moving parts to that. And I don't foresee them wanting to change their model that way. What was the second question?
How do you think it might impact the fighters?
How do I think? I think that if they were to go to a streaming service or just move away from ESPN, I think it will negatively impact the fighters because ESPN is the mothership of sports, especially in the United States. When we go to ESPN.com, we always look for, what's in that ticker line. What's the first thing that they have showing? And because the UFC is aligned with ESPN, if something happens in the UFC, it's going to make that first page. It's super important to them. Not only there, then you got First Take. They're going to talk about it. You're going to have Get Up. They're going to talk about it. You're going to have all these other shows that feed into the machine that is ESPN, which is going to feed into the machine that's the UFC. If they don't have that free marketing, so to speak, that'll be detrimental to not only the UFC as a whole, but the fighters individually. And that's where the fighters are going to start to suffer. The fighters do a pretty good job of promoting themselves individually, but they can only go so far considering the fact they can't get their own sponsorships. So this, in a sense, supplements that by
Skinny
them
bets,
being
shout out to Skinny Bets.
For real. So I think that it'll be another strike against them. And I mean, at some point they're gonna have to wise up and get together and do something about this, because they just keep on taking L's. And it's not the top tier. It's not the top tier. It's the middle to bottom tier that are always taking these L's, and they refuse to see it or refuse to do anything about it.
Yeah,
they're gonna suffer.
They are. I think everyone from top to bottom is getting fleeced out. I think this is part of what's interesting about the financial situation. Now we know that like the pay-per-view model has been, I mean, it's been criticized for a number of years, especially we have talked about finances quite a lot recently, because it has been a steady topic that we've talked about in both our channels, really, with pay-per-view prices especially steadily increasing over the years. I know you get inflation and whatnot. How much is the pay-per-view card for you guys now?
It's $80.
$80. The thing for me that's what's kind of leading me into the argument that I'm about to make. We talked about free streaming in the past. We know that free streaming makes up an enormous bulk of viewership because, to put it simply, people aren't paying what amounts to be not just $80 a month. Sometimes it's double that when you get 2 pay-per-views in a month. It can sometimes amount to $160 a month if you want to get 2 pay-per-views. Mm-hmm. Now, the UFC's stance in this negotiation is that while the original deal with ESPN was very lucrative for the time when they made it, they're now pulling in far more viewers and ultimately not making as much as they potentially could be now. And I think what you said about ESPN being a part of that growth is massive. And I think the UFC is aware of that. And it does come down to numbers. Now, people are kind of leaning more towards, as we know, streaming services are how most consumers consume digital content right now. Mm-hmm. Like, the money that Netflix is making is insanity compared to the one-off pay-per-view model that any organization is doing. It just is. If you think about the mass subscriber count that they get, it's enormous. And I firmly believe that that's the direction that the UFC's... They might not want to go in that direction, but they're going to go in that direction. I think the UFC is going to potentially go down the streaming route. I'm with you. I think that they're going to end up staying with ESPN and then adopting a kind of a model where subscribers pay, they pay for their ESPN Plus, and then they probably end up paying an additional $15 a month or whatever it is, $15, $20 a month to get all fight cards and all pay-per-views. It could end up being Netflix or somebody else, but I think they're going to end up being part of that system. And I think because of what you mentioned about being part of that ESPN ecosystem and the fact that the advertising that they get from it and the fact that the ESPN is the go-to for American sports, would let people get... I have the ESPN app on my phone and I'm in the UK to get updates. That's how big the ESPN is globally, not just in America. And I think that would lead to a massive chunk of the people that free stream making that deficit up comfortably. Because I don't believe people are free streaming because they're criminal assholes and they just want to steal the programming. Because we all know that illegal streaming is a pain in the ass. You know, you're constantly dealing with pop-ups, you're dealing with constantly having to refresh, things get taken down. People don't want to do that. Nope. The reason why they're not paying, the reason why they're doing that is because they can't, the majority of households can't afford to pay $80 or $160 a month to buy these cards. Nope. Like, they can't do it. So they're resorting to paying for or not paying for free streaming. Like, and also if you think about it, like, what's the average pay-per-view sales without say a Conor McGregor or a Ronda Rousey on them?
I mean, it's got to be...
They're not getting anywhere...
200, 300?
This is the point. I'd say they average 200,000 to 300,000 pay-per-view buys. Now, on the UFC side, it's kind of beneficial as well, because if they move to a streaming system, one thing that a lot of people aren't considering is it could then have a direct impact on the pay-per-view point model that they've got now. Because they would effectively have to end that. And they pay out a lot of money in pay-per-view points to champions. Whereas if they move to a streaming model, they could effectively kill that as well. Yep. And just say, right, we're going to give you a flat fee because... And knowing how the UFC operate, you know they want to bring an end to that system. And this could be a very, very sneaky way of doing that. Mm-hmm. Like, I think that ultimately moving to a streaming platform where they're gradually building up subscribers over time, rather than depending on, because again, if you think about it, you can either get like an average 300,000 paying $80 a month, which is again is quite a high average, because I don't think they do that many. I think 300,000, let's say 300,000 objectively at $80 a month, on which you have to pay out pay-per-view points based on the stars that raise those numbers directly. Or you can charge $15 a month for consistently raising subscriptions that are shown to number in the multi-millions on other platforms. And then you can then use that to justify not paying points because the subscriber count is already there and it's gradually increasing. So you can turn around to a star who's leading a card and say, well, the subscriber count is what it is. And you can even make a deal for, oh, we'll give you a percentage of how many new subscribers join, which would be significantly lower. But if you could do away with the point system as well as doing a subscriber-based, I think you would rake in a big chunk of those fans that are willing to pay for it but just can't. And that would make up for it. And your overall, and again, it's just the trend of the way people are buying things now.
Yeah.
How many people, like, I assume you use Netflix.
Yep.
I don't know many people that don't.
Yeah.
Like, if I ask most people, and I mean, I could talk to people who are ridiculously cheap or not, everyone uses Netflix, pretty much. It's just the way people are paying for content these days. And I think if the UFC did a similar thing and they did it with ESPN, they would get bigger than ever, and they'd rake in more fans than ever, and the bottom line would be bigger than ever.
I totally agree. I mean, if they did something where they just, if ESPN said, we're going to offer you you can have Disney Plus, you can have ESPN, you can have Hulu, and we'll give you pay-per-view fights, and we're just going to up your thing by $20. Sign me up immediately. I'm in. And their subscriber count would be massive because, like you pointed out, there's so many people who illegally stream because they have to, and it's a pain. It's awful.
Yeah.
And they miss things. There's the sound is lagging. There's always issues. And ESPN's app is not great. I'm not going to lie to you and say that it's great, because it ain't. But it's more reliable than streaming on these illegal platforms. Not to mention ESPN will start to get an accurate count of who's actually watching, which I'm sure the UFC definitely would appreciate, to have accurate numbers. And the pay-per-view model would have to go out the window, but they could still do it based on the Nielsen rating or whatever they use to calculate how many people viewed. ESPN already has a model that they use, so they can get those numbers, which means it'll be transparent for us too. So now we'll actually know how many viewers actually watch these things, and we don't have to rely on Dana White to say, oh no, it sold 2 million pay-per-view buys. I mean, I guess it's what.
Do you think the UFC might be a little bit scared of that?
Yes, I think that they would
maybe they're massaging the numbers a little bit.
I wouldn't. I mean,
wouldn't be surprised.
We met Dana. We know. We know he's gonna pump it up, but that's what promoters do. I'm not mad at him, but we'll get the real deal. We'll really understand like what's really going on out there. And I mean, maybe that's why, they are hesitant to do those sorts of things, because the illusion kind of helps sell things. But I feel like they're past that now. They're past it. We're going to watch regardless. We'll complain. We'll hem and haw, whatever, but we're going to watch it. So just make it easier for us to watch, easier for us to get to.
And like $20 a month is so sellable to people. Even the cheapest amongst us would think it's $20 a month. If I'm going to get a reliable stream every week, you're doing it all day long, but you're not paying whatever it is for Fight Pass, and then you're paying, like I said, for potentially 2 pay-per-views a month. Like it's a very difficult. People are living on a budget. A lot of people, the majority of people who watch the UFC, I guarantee you, I'd go as far to say it's probably 80 to 90% of people who watch the UFC can't afford to legally justify paying $80 or $160 a month
No.
to pay for events, and especially when it's on cards that you might not give a fuck about. Like, because the majority of pay-per-views you get, you'd be like, well, it's a decent pay-per-view, but if your only way was watching it was to pay for it, you still couldn't or wouldn't do it because you're like, nah, I'm not really that much into that fight, or I'll see what happens tomorrow. I'll look at the clips tomorrow rather than pay for it if illegal streaming wasn't out there.
Yeah.
So it just is what it is, and I think you'd rope in a good 20% of those people at the very least. At the very least,
if not exponentially more than that.
More. Thing is, one thing that I can tell you now, a lot more people are watching the UFC than they think they are, because they don't know what the numbers are in terms of I guarantee if they added up accurately how many people were illegally streaming it every week as well.
Oh yeah, numbers be stupid.
Millions.
Numbers would be dumb.
Millions. It would literally be times 10. I firmly believe, if not more.
Yeah.
And if you could get, like I said, even 20-30% of those to actually pay for it, whew, where you can show the advertisers this is how many people are definitely watching it,
mm-hmm.
Bro, I think they do it.
I think so.
I think they do it.